As millions of young people took to the streets across Canada and around the world for the climate strike, politicians on the campaign trail tried to jump in front of the parade. The Liberals announced environmental protections, green home retrofit grants, and loans and a net zero emissions promise by 2050. The Conservatives also announced tax credits for green home renovation, and the NDP promised to electrify public transit, create a climate bank to fund a west-east clean energy grid, and protect Canada's coastline. But who has the best plan? What is credible? Let's bring in some candidates to find out. Steven Guilbeault is a Liberal candidate for Quebec. John Brassard is a Conservative candidate for Ontario. And Peter Julian is an NDP candidate in British Columbia. Gents, thanks for joining us. And Mr. Guilbeault, let me just start with you. After your party announced it wants to go net zero, the country to go net zero by 2050, the NDP responded. They said, you bought a pipeline. How does the Liberal Party try to lead on climate change when it spent $4.5 billion on the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion? Is that hypocrisy?
I disagree with the pipeline. I've said it before, even if I joined the Liberal Party, and I did so because when I looked at everything that had been done, for $1 that's been invested in the pipeline, 15 have been invested in the fight against climate change. We've record level investment in electrification of our transportation, public transit, green infrastructure, and green technologies. So not perfect, but the carbon pollution is going down in Canada, and we need to do so much more, and that's why I decided to jump in the arena.
Okay, I just want to clarify. You're running for the Liberals, and you think they made a mistake buying the Trans Mountain Pipeline. You don't think they should build the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is diametrically opposed to what Mr. Trudeau says, and you're a Liberal. Is that fair?
It is, because you can look at a tree and totally lose sight of the forest. And I've decided to look at the forest. I disagree with one thing, but I agree with a whole bunch of others.
Okay, it's a $4.5 billion thing. We'll talk about that in a minute. Mr. Brassard, let me talk to you. Mr. Scheer refused to march in any climate protest parades. His plan for GHG emission reductions has no targets and no measurements. How are we actually supposed to believe he's sincerely committed to this?
Well, what you saw with the climate action that took place across Canada, Andrew was actually, instead of like the other leaders trying to climb over themselves to be seen at this thing, he was actually out in Vancouver making announcements that were practical, that were going to have significant impacts on people's lives as it relates to commuting. He announced 4 specific projects on Friday that are going to see them come to fruition under a Conservative government. And those targets that you talk about are the exact same targets in the Paris Accord. Those are targets that we've committed to with our real plan for the environment.
But Mr. Brassard, to be fair, you've committed to those targets, but the plan to get there has no number. So let me try a number that I've tried to get from the Conservatives. In the Conservative plan, big emitters are supposed to pay into a carbon tech fund once they pass the threshold. So let me ask you, what price will your party put on carbon in order to tell them what they have to pay? You're clearly putting a price on carbon. What is it?
Well, we're putting a price on carbon as it relates to the amount of emissions that the largest emitters put out there. But
so
the most important thing to understand is that, but we're going to determine that.
Okay,
Evan,
I just want to be clear. You're going to put a price on carbon as well. So the Liberals put a price, the NDP and the Conservatives will too.
For the largest emitters, but that price won't be revenue that's going to go into the government coffers. And I'll remind you too that some of the largest polluters in this country have received an exemption from the Liberals. What we're asking those companies to do is reinvest that into green tech.
They did not receive an exemption.
Into green technology. We're asking that it be reinvested into green technology so that they can further reduce their emissions. So it's going to produce clean technology, and clean jobs are going to be associated with that as well.
All right, Mr. Guilbeault, I know you want to respond, but let me just bring in quickly Peter Julian, and then I'll let you all respond. Your party wants to build a clean energy corridor. Mr. Scheer wants to do the same, an energy corridor, but all that depends on the promises. Why should we believe that Mr. Singh could go to Alberta, talk to Premier Jason Kenney when he's actively against all pipelines and say, please help me out on my clean energy corridor? That doesn't, what credibility does Mr. Singh have on that issue with someone like Mr. Kenney?
It's a question of jobs, Evan, and we know that with our plan, rather than building the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and the Liberals have been appallingly hypocritical about that, we would be investing $15 billion in clean energy production. That results in 300,000 jobs. And I've been into Alberta. I've spoken to oil and gas workers because I come from the industry. I used to work at the oil refinery here in Burnaby. And so when you talk about that transition to clean energy, oil and gas workers are excited too, with the potential for jobs in clean energy sector as a result of establishing the grid and making sure we can export to the United States. Is something that I think all Canadians can get behind. And at the same time, it helps us to deal with the climate change crisis that's upon us.
Mr. Guilbeault, I know you wanted to respond. The Conservatives say that you've let big emitters off the hook. What's the response?
Simply not true. The federal system was based on the Quebec and BC system, and they have to pay up just like everybody else. Some sectors got a little bit less intensive demand because they're more trade exposed, but we did the same thing in Quebec, and our emissions are going down. No one gets a free pass, and they're paying. I do have a question for Peter, because this hypocrisy theory is interesting, because in 2015 I was on stage with Premier Notley when she announced her climate change plan, which included a whole bunch of great things like eliminating coal-fired electricity, more renewables, a cap on emissions from the tar sands, a carbon tax. But we knew she wanted a pipeline. But I still supported her because I thought that this was a real step in the right direction. And the federal NDP supported her. So what Peter is saying is that it's okay to support a government that does a lot of things we like on climate change, even though we disagree on one thing like the pipeline, only if it's an NDP government. But if it's a Liberal government that does pretty much the same thing as what the NDP Alberta government was doing, then oh my God, what a hypocrisy! I have trouble reconciling.
Can I respond, Evan? Can I respond?
Yeah,
First off, $17 billion is what the Liberals want to spend of taxpayers' money. A few years ago, and yes, the NDP's position has evolved on this, but a few years ago, it wasn't government taxpayers' funding going in to $17 billion for a project that actually loses jobs in British Columbia and
so your issue
increases
is with the money,
cost
not with the pipeline
to our
itself.
economy
Is that what you're saying?
Of climate change. It's $5 billion already. It will rise to $50 billion over the next 30 years. For Liberals to say, we care about the environment, but we want to ram through this pipeline at $17 billion is ridiculous.
Okay, guys, I just for time, there's a lot of debate. I just got to bring in Mr. Brassard. Just one thing. Mr. Scheer says he could build pipelines, this energy corridor, but he's got to go through the courts. I'm just trying to figure out what's different with the Trans Mountain. The Trans Mountain pipeline also has to go through the court, and it's being held up. Mr. Scheer's criticizing it, but on the other hand, he's saying, well, the courts will determine another pipeline. What would he do differently is my question.
Well, I think Andrew announced very clearly what he would do differently. A national corridor, he would implement a blue ribbon task force to look at all of the issues that need to be looked at, including Indigenous issues, issues related to provincial and territorial autonomy, and how we can get the provinces and the territories on board. But I think it's a very bold, I think it's a very ambitious plan. I think it's a pragmatic plan as well.
But
one
what's
that
different? I'm not sure what's different. But what's I mean, I've got a couple seconds. What's different? The Liberals did the same thing for the NEB plan. What's different about this plan?
But it would provide, Evan, some certainty as to where these linear routes are going to go. And those linear routes could include pipelines, they could include clean tech, green energy transmission, and not just energy flowing west to east, but also the potential for energy to flow east to west. This task force will work with everybody to make sure that this energy corridor is in place and it works for Canada with respect to big energy projects.
Guys, lots to discuss here. Obviously, we'll wait to see what happens in the big debate coming up. But Steven Guilbeault, John Brassard, and Peter Julian, I got to leave it there for today. I really appreciate the three of you coming in to join us.